Um, so in this video, I wanted to make a part two to my series about going low and no contact with my parents. I decided to do a separate video discussing my relationship with my dad and then a separate video discussing my relationship with my mom because they really are very different, both full of issues and problems in their own way, but really each kind of warranted their own separate discussion. I think that'll probably be a little bit easier for me to discuss because although a lot of the events and things that happened and the issues do kind of intertwine with one another, at the same time, it's kind of easier for the purposes of sort of separating my story. And I did deal with the relationships quite differently. And I think perhaps that also might be more helpful for someone watching these videos to kind of see how I approach those relationships differently. As I mentioned in my last video, my parents divorced when I was little. And so I, from the age of about 7, only saw my dad every second weekend and every second school holiday. That was just the norm in those days. In South Africa, court systems pretty much universally gave that sort of a custody arrangement to divorced couples where children would stay most of the time with their mothers in virtually all cases, and their fathers would see them every second weekend and every second school holiday. And so that's how it was in my family. My dad was full of bitterness towards my mom when she left him. He has never really got over that, even though that was well over 30 years ago. He still kind of blames her, I think, on some level for kind of ruining his life in a sense. And he definitely blames her for the, why he and I are not close anymore. I think at the root of it, he believes that it all stemmed from when my mom left him and took my brother and I away. He has never kind of, that I can see, engaged in any sort of self-reflection or taken any personal accountability for why our relationship is pretty much non-existent or has been so strained over the years. And again, that in itself, that lack of accountability, that lack of self-reflection, that lack of any sort of apology is also at the root of, why he and I are not in contact anymore. Someone who doesn't have the ability to apologize or self-reflect or make changes or even just show any evidence that they believe that they're not perfect is not someone I can really have any kind of relationship with. And that's the bottom line. I would consider myself to be a pretty patient and forgiving person, especially when it comes to my family. I think I have put up with an awful lot and not come to any of these decisions quickly or lightly. And yet, at this point in time, it is just very apparent to me that my dad is who he is. He's a very self-absorbed person. He is very self-involved, and he seems to have little awareness for how he impacts other people, and even less kind of willingness to work on himself or make changes. And so the decision to cut off my relationship with him, I wouldn't exactly say it was easy, but once I realized that that's who he was and that's how he was, and that he really had no regard for the hurt that he'd caused or might still continue to cause, the decision, I think, became perhaps a lot more straightforward, a lot simpler for me to make. And so I think this gets said in every video that I've ever seen about children cutting off relationships with their parents. The fact that it is not something we want to do. It's not something which is a decision we come to quickly or hastily or easily. I think that needs to be said here as well. This is difficult for me to talk about, even though I feel like in many ways I've healed from a lot of these issues. I don't still feel really pain or hurt or even a lot of anger towards my dad anymore. We've had minimal contact for decades now, really. And that's given me a lot of time to process my feelings and to think about things and to really move on. And so I don't approach this issue with any degree of resentment or bitterness, or, as I say, I don't even really feel hurt or angry anymore. Most of those feelings have just dissipated over the years. And I just feel a sense of being resigned and being able to peacefully move on. And I think that's probably the best that you can hope for when it comes to going no contact with a parent. You're never going to kind of look at the decision as a happy decision. There's nothing happy about cutting off the relationship with one of your parents. Parenting, when it's done right, it can really provide so much support and love and care and help to a person. I look at people who have really strong and positive relationships with their parents, and I just see how much they benefit from those relationships, how much they get out of those relationships. And I don't have that at all when it comes to my dad. I'm not able to benefit from the relationship with him in any of those ways. And so there's nothing happy really about that. So I think if you are someone who has cut off a parent, or that's what you're considering doing for your own well-being, I think it is important to be realistic about what you can expect when you do that. It's probably never going to be something that you look on with, happiness or good feelings about. But I think the best that you can hope for is perhaps a sense of relief, or a release of, a lot of those difficult feelings or hurts, potentially frustration, disappointment, all those negative feelings that we feel when a parent has really badly let us down. And that's what it was like for me. I spent, as I say, years kind of processing my own feelings around all of this. And eventually I was just able to let go. And although I will never know what it means to have a really present and caring and supportive father, at the same time, I also am free of the pain that I experienced from having him as a dad when I was growing up. When I think back to a time when I still loved my dad, when I was pretty young and, a little girl, and then even as a teenager, I would say I still, really loved him and felt attached to him. But even when I think back on those years when I did feel love towards my dad, the impression that I have as well, in addition to the love, what I also remember feeling was just this wish that he would do better, that he would be better, that he would be a better dad, because he was never a great one. And that's what he fails to realize. I think he sort of sees our relationship in terms of these rifts that have happened. first with my mother leaving him, and then with me going through stages of not wanting to be in contact with him. He sees these rifts that have happened, and he sees that as the reason, those are the reasons why our relationship isn't good. He's never kind of reflected on what kind of a father he was, and that even when he was present in my life, he just really wasn't that great. I talked in my last video about how he always provided the very bare minimum in terms of financial support, even though he was doing well financially. He's always had a very prestigious career as a highly qualified university professor. He has a PhD in statistics, which is a very, very kind of rare qualification. And so he's always had these very prestigious work opportunities and always done well financially. And yet we, as his children, always got the bare minimum in terms of financial support. I will say he paid my school fees for me to attend quite a privileged private girls' school. That was something that my mom insisted on. Both he and my mom really believed in giving us the best possible education. And so that was probably the only thing he was willing to spend money on. But outside of our school fees, he didn't pay anything. That was the agreement that he came to with my mom. He paid my school fees and then absolutely nothing else. So, I've spoken before about how when we visited him, he would just provide the absolute bare minimum in terms of, food and clothes and a roof over our head. We just never really did anything or went anywhere. We never got any birthday presents or Christmas presents. He never bought us anything. He took us on a handful of holidays during the whole course of my life. There were a few trips that he took us on, and I think that was really as much for his own benefit as for our benefit. It was just very much stuff he wanted to do, and he brought us along, and none of that happened once he got married. These were just during his single years. There wasn't much time in my relationship with my dad that he was single. It was pretty, limited periods of time. And as soon as he got married, his new wife became 100% his focus. And we kind of became a bit of an afterthought. And so that's how it was, There was a lot of neglect in my relationship with my dad. He was very much about serving his own interests. And my brother and I just had to be happy with whatever we got, and not talk back and not criticize him in any way. There were no kind of negative feelings allowed. We weren't allowed to voice our resistance to anything. We were supposed to just be told what to do and be happy about that. And my dad is now on his way, from what I know, he is on his way to getting married to wife number 4. So he married a series of women over the course of his life. One of them was a really awful person. And I mean that in the sense that she was really awful to me and my brother. He met her when I was 15, and they were married for about 25, 26 years, something like that. She died last year. And my dad met a new woman, literally must have been weeks later. Weeks after his third wife died, he had already met a new woman that he was passionate about. So I think that kind of gives you an idea of the type of person that my dad is. I don't want to spend this entire video kind of bashing him As I say, in many ways, I have already dealt with my feelings about my dad and about his choices in life. And although I could detail all of it, I don't really think that would necessarily be good for me. I don't think it would necessarily make me feel all that good, especially considering that I've moved on and I'm at peace with my decision not to have contact with him. I thought it would probably be more helpful both for me and for anyone watching this video if I talked about my reasons for going no contact rather than, having limited contact, and how I feel why I feel that's important, how it's impacted me, what I've learned from that. And so I think, as I say, I think that would probably be better for my own sense of self-reflection, but also for people who might be in a similar position and wondering, should I maintain a relationship with my father or not? The relationship's not that great. You always are eventually, you eventually get to a point where you have to decide on the boundaries of the relationship and what you feel you can manage, what it's worth to you, and how to move forward. And so I thought I'd maybe talk a little bit about my decision-making process and how I got to that point. So I wanted to divide up my reasons for going no contact with my dad into 3 categories, and then just kind of discuss those broad categories of reasons one by one, just to give you a sense of how I arrived at this decision and why I believe it's better for me. So the first category of reasons has to do with just the history of my relationship with my dad. And if you are someone who is perhaps wondering about going no contact with a parent, I think this is probably the first place to look when it comes to just evaluating your relationship. And for me, the history of my relationship with my dad kind of played a very, very big role, obviously. My dad was never really that present to begin with, even despite the custody arrangements that he had with my mom, us visiting every second weekend and every second school holiday. He had just countless opportunities to be more involved in our lives, which he just didn't take, especially with me. I mean, my brother was very sporty. And so there was at least sort of some opportunity for my dad, who was also sporty, to be kind of a little bit involved with my brother's sports. But my dad had so many opportunities to take an interest in things that were going on in my life, and he just didn't. He could have taken us for extra time during the week. My mom wouldn't have minded that. I already know that. He could have attended things at my school. He just never did. He was just very, very much involved with his own life and his own goings on. And he just wasn't around. I gave the example of when I was 8 years old, he just moved to New Zealand for a year and a half and took a lecturing position there with no kind of thought or explanation for what that would mean for me and my brother. He just kind of did as he pleased. And a lot of the time that just meant being very sort of absent in our lives. I talked in the last video as well about how he used to leave us alone for hours and hours and hours on end in the, on the weekends that we visited him. When he was married to a woman or in a relationship with a woman, we got virtually no attention at all. And so he just wasn't present. It was, in terms of time, he wasn't present. In terms of like financial support, he wasn't present. He has never once in my entire life helped me with anything, anything significant. I mean, he might have helped me with homework a little bit when I was in school, but he's never once helped me move houses. he didn't help me to buy a car. He didn't provide any help or financial support. It's just been absolutely nothing for as long as I can remember. His involvement has been so minimal. And when he married his third wife, who was a really, as I say, a really, really awful person, just from the point of view of me and my brother, he essentially left us to the wolves, so to speak. He didn't stand up for us or intervene when she was being horrible to us. If anything, he took the stance that it was our fault, that we were being mistreated by her. And I could honestly speak for days just about that aspect alone, but I'm not going to for the purposes of this video. I just, don't really feel the need to relive all of that, but it was highly, highly traumatic. And my dad just, always took the path of least resistance and did what benefited him the most. And most of the time that meant not showing up for me or my brother. And so there was just never really that much there. There was not really that much to salvage as far as I was concerned in terms of maintaining a relationship. It was never a relationship that had much of a foundation or much substance to begin with. So I think like that, as I say, that was a huge part of my decision-making process. What was I really hanging on to if I was going to continue having a relationship with my dad? Any feelings of love that I'd ever felt towards him were very much mingled with this idea of, I just wish he would do better as a dad. I wish he wasn't kind of such a deadbeat in a way. He wasn't a deadbeat in the sense that he didn't skip out on his obligation, like his financial obligations altogether. He provided the absolute bare minimum. He was present in our lives to a degree, but it was so minimal. I never felt like I could rely on him or turn to him. He was just, a very self-absorbed person, and that translated into a relationship in which there was really not much invested into his relationship with me. So, probably from his point of view, he probably thinks that the relationship was just fine. It was probably maybe to an extent how he was brought up. I don't know. I don't know enough about his relationship with my grandparents to know if that's what he was kind of basing his version of fatherhood on. But I do know that from where I was standing, there was just very little there. There was very little to salvage, very little to save. So maybe things would have been different if my dad and I had been closer, or if he'd showed up more in my life, if he'd been there more, if he had made more of an effort. But he just never really did. He always just took the path of least resistance and doing the bare minimum. And so our relationship reflected that. And it made it that much easier, honestly, to let go of that relationship. So that's something you might want to think about if you are kind of evaluating your relationship with your parents. What has the history of the relationship been like? And what has it looked like over the years? And what are you hanging on to? What is the substance of the relationship? Is that parent someone that you can turn to? Are they someone who has been there or is able to be there for you? In my case, as I say, both my parents were, I would say, pretty self-absorbed. They were always seemed to me to be far more focused on their own concerns. And I always felt like an afterthought, and that I always just had to make do with the scraps. And as you sort of get to adulthood, and well, in my case, as I became an adult and I realized actually I'm not happy with scraps in my relationship. I actually want to be really loved and supported and seen. And I want someone who gives to the relationship and prioritizes me. And why should I hang on to a relationship where someone is only doing the absolute bare minimum to keep me around? And I definitely can't depend on them to have my back. They're not in my corner. You know, my dad, as I say, threw me to the wolves so many times and blamed me for the fact that my stepmother mistreated us. And I just, I could never depend on him. I could never really feel like this is a safe and reliable person for me to turn to. He was incredibly critical. Nothing that I ever did was good enough, although he didn't seem to turn that same scrutiny onto himself. He never kind of evaluated his own parenting skills with the same harshness. It was his version of what a father was just seemed to be someone who was distant and cold and critical and just not really all that involved, to be honest. I think my dad did love me in his own way. He still does. I know it upsets him that we're not in contact, but he's very much upset for his own sake and not so much upset because of what I might be missing out on. I don't think he's honestly ever given that any thought. Like, how could he be showing up for me? How could he be helping and supporting me? And that I might be missing out, and how might it have affected me to be without that support and love all these years? I don't think he has ever thought about that. And I think sometimes when it comes to parents who get cut off by their children, I do think a lot of it probably comes down to self-absorption on the part of the parents in many cases. They think about how hard it's been for them, and they think about, you know, their own feelings and not maybe what their children might have missed out on, and how difficult it might have been for their children to experience that relationship. It's this lack of empathy. It's this lack of an ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes. With my dad, that is totally lacking. I don't think I've ever seen him put himself in someone else's shoes and truly think about what a situation might be like for someone other than himself. So again, that made it easier for me to make the decision to cut off contact, because when someone has never really been there for you in the first place, you're sort of like, well, what am I holding on to anyway? It's not it's not worth it for me, really. As kind of that kind of might seem a little bit calculating, but I don't look at it that way. I think relationships are about help and support and how we show up for one another. And if someone is just not doing that, well, what is the relationship really worth anyway, So the second reason, or I suppose category of reasons, really, because I think there's lots of little kind of sub-reasons within this one category or within each category, has to do with the fact that my dad just really doesn't know me as a person. He doesn't know who my friends are. He doesn't know what my interests are. He doesn't know who I'm dating. He really doesn't know anything. He doesn't know what pets I have. He knows very little about my job. And it's really always been this way. Conversations with my dad are not really conversations. They're sort of an opportunity for him to talk and to sort of pretend as if he's listening. And I know he probably doesn't see it this way. He probably thinks that he's very interested in my life. And for him, that interest takes the form of asking me very basic questions for about 5 minutes and then spending the rest of the conversation talking about himself. And that is just how it is with him and how it's always been, really. I've sat through so many lectures from my dad that I thought were going to be conversations that I just, you tune out eventually. The sort of the most contact that I've had with my dad over the last 5 or 6 years has been in the form of like maybe monthly phone calls, which I stopped on my birthday last year. But the year before, I had kind of taken a decision that I would get back in contact with my dad and attempt to have some sort of a low contact relationship. In other words, have these sort of maybe monthly brief phone calls where we could just quickly check in with each other so that I could sort of feel as if I at least knew that he was okay and he could check that I was okay. And I sort of thought maybe that could work. Maybe that would be something I could live with or I could do. And the phone calls honestly just left me feeling more and more empty. And that's the problem with low contact, I think. You really have to be in a place where those conversations either don't affect you at all, or you have no expectations from them, or they're not negatively impacting you in any way. But what I found is, because of my dad's tendency to be so self-absorbed, I was just struggling to muster up even the smallest amount of energy to talk to him on the phone. I would kind of feel anxious just seeing his name come up on my phone. I began to dread those phone calls. I began, coming up with reasons to put the phone calls off. And really it had to do with the fact that anytime I picked up the phone, he would listen to me talk about my life for maybe, as I say, maybe 5 minutes out of the conversation. He would ask me a couple of very basic questions. I think he was barely listening when I answered. He was just sort of waiting to give his own opinion. And then he would spend the rest of the conversation talking about himself. So it was probably 1 minute of me talking about myself to every 5 minutes of him talking about himself. So it was like maybe sort of a quarter, 3/4 kind of a ratio. And he didn't even really need much of a response from me when he was talking about himself. He seemed to just be wanting an audience to listen. He just seemed to have wanted to talk, and just wasn't really interested in my feedback very much. So I would come away from the phone calls thinking, like, what was the point of that? I don't feel like he knows any more about me, or I don't feel like he's really that interested. I started studying to be a counselor about 1.5 years ago now, and my dad just could not have been less interested. He didn't even try to pretend that he was interested. And honestly, it feels like that with anything that I share with him about my life. And this is just about the very surface level stuff, like what I'm doing with my life. That it doesn't even begin to touch deeper issues, like what I think and feel about things. He doesn't know me on a deeper level, who I am as a person, what I think, what I feel, what my opinions are, what my views are. He doesn't know what I believe. He doesn't ask me about those things. He doesn't seem to be interested or care, really. I feel like the relationship, again, and this is very much related to my first sort of set of reasons, it's very much a one-way street with him, where he is trying to milk the relationship for as much as he can get out of it. Whatever kind of support and attention and validation he can get from having a relationship with me, that's what he's most interested in. And I just feel like there's really very, very little interest in who I am as a person. And that's very much manifested in his behavior. That's not just a perception that I have. That is something I could provide lots and lots of examples for. I don't think he could tell you exactly what I do for a living if you put a gun to his head. I don't think he could tell you any of the things that I enjoy doing. As I say, he just knows very little about me, and it's been that way for a very long time. And again, that's just got to do with my dad's self-absorption. And so it sort of feeds back into my first point of there's just not very much there to hang on to. There's not very much substance to the relationship anyway, from my point of view. He might get something out of having a relationship with me, but I get very little out of it. And I just am I'm long past the point where I'm simply going to have a relationship with him, purely so that he can benefit and so that he can feel as if someone is listening to him without him ever having to listen to me. And that goes even to the deeper issues, problems that we've had in the past with our relationship, things that he's done that have really hurt me over the years that I've never been able to address because he just simply doesn't want to hear it. He's not interested. And again, that just feeds into he's not interested really in my feelings, in my opinions, in what my life has been like for me. I think I'm very much an object to him. And I mean that in the sense that he likes the idea of having a daughter, a very kind of doting daughter that he can feel proud of, that he can sort of get good feelings for himself about himself as a father. He likes the thought of himself as a father, but me as a person, he just doesn't know me. And I think if he truly put the effort into knowing me, I don't think he would necessarily even find that much to be interested in, or maybe even that much to like. I don't know. But that's a huge part of why I just don't have contact with him anymore. I just feel the connection is just simply completely lacking. And conversations with him are just more draining than they're actually worth. It just feels to me like a duty and an obligation to talk to him. And there's really no joy in it for me. It's very much something that I get the feeling that he's doing in order to gratify himself in some way, and he isn't really interested, as usual, in what I get out of the relationship. So, I also think when past hurts and past traumas go unaddressed with a parent, it slowly just leads to this rift that grows and grows between you until it feels like this huge chasm. And the relationship just does become superficial because you're sort of left holding the bag of all of those things that happened and the ways in which you were hurt as a child. And the parent just refuses to address it or even to listen. And so that whole area, for potential connection is lost. And you realize that the only points of contact or points of connection are sort of the more superficial aspects of life. And I'm not a superficial person. I struggle to have any relationships that are based only on superficial conversations. I find them, as a neurodivergent person, those sorts of relationships and conversations are incredibly draining to me. Social interaction already takes quite a lot out of me. But if it's worth it in terms of it being a nourishing and deep and fulfilling relationship, then I'm more than happy to do it. But when it comes to people with whom I can only have these very superficial connections and very superficial conversations, and people who are incredibly self-absorbed, I just can't do it. I can't make myself do it. It's almost physically impossible for me to do it. I have so little energy for that. So if you get it, you get it. If you know, you know. If this resonates with you, then I'm sure that you understand where I'm coming from, and I probably don't even need to try to explain it anymore. But that is also a big part of my decision to go no contact with my dad. It's the fact that I just don't feel seen or known or heard by him at all. I feel like a two-dimensional, representation of a person rather than a real person to him. He just knows very little about me and he has very little interest. And so, yeah, that was a big part of it for me as well. And so, actually, related to that point about my dad not really knowing me, or being very interested in my life, and everything being all about him, that is actually what led to my decision to cut him off completely. I've gone for long periods of time, for decades now, of not having contact with him. And then there've been a few occasions that I've tried to reestablish contact. And inevitably something happens which leads me to the conclusion that I was better off having no contact. And that's what happened this most recent time. So I mentioned that I had decided to try and do kind of a form of low contact, like a phone call once a month or so. And I was just finding those phone calls to be incredibly draining. And what happened was that on my birthday last year, he called me in the morning of my birthday and he wished me happy birthday. And I think he spent like maybe a minute not even asking me really about myself or what I was doing for my birthday or how I was enjoying it. He spent a minute telling me that he, about himself, essentially, about how he could remember the day that I was born and how he felt and all this sort of thing. And that was the extent of his birthday wishes. And then he launched straight into telling me about the new woman that he'd been seeing. And this was just mere weeks after, that he'd met this woman mere weeks after his third wife had died. And so this was like maybe 2 or 3 months after her death. And he was already very serious with a new woman. And he was telling me this a couple of minutes into the phone call that he'd made to wish me happy birthday. And that was just like something thumping me over the head. And like it was a real 2x4 between the eyes. Like, oh my gosh, this man really doesn't care about anyone but himself. Here he is on my birthday, barely interested in the fact that it's my birthday and that supposedly he's phoned me to wish me happy birthday. All he's interested in is talking about himself and this new woman that he's met. And not even, was no sensitivity around it at all. And how weird and wacky it was, to be honest, to be speaking this way a couple of months after your previous wife has died. It's just no self-awareness at all with this man. And I was like, you know what? I've actually had enough. And my body felt it. And I realized this isn't the case with everyone who goes no contact with their parents. Sometimes it's a decision that people agonize over for months or years on end, and they go back and forth, and it's not so cut and dry. But for me, in this case with my dad, it became very cut and dry. My body, just in that moment when he started talking like that, my body just said, you know what? No more. No more. I'm done now. I'm actually done. And I was just completely done in that moment. And I could just, end the conversation pretty quickly. And I then went and blocked him. And I felt complete peace about it. As I say, it was a build-up that happened over a very long period of time, really, in the sense that, we went long periods of time without talking. And then I'd reestablish contact, but inevitably I'd cut off contact again. But that phone call on my birthday was just a huge, wake up call, really, that he's never going to change. This is really, really just not benefiting me in any way whatsoever. And in actual fact, it's just purely a drain on my energy and on my life that's, by a very self-absorbed person. And I do think in some ways, you know, our societal expectations around family have both benefits and downsides. On one hand, a family, when it's working well as a system, can really provide a lot of support and protection to the members within that family. And there's a lot of love and care that goes along with that. But on the other hand, family obligations can really mask a lot of very, very destructive and selfish behavior as well. And it can really make a person feel far too obligated to people who just don't have their best interests at heart at all, who they should be distancing themselves from. And that's something I could talk at length about. And I suppose I'm just sort of peppering my ideas about that within these discussions. But that's what happened to finally kind of get me to the point where I cut off contact with my dad altogether. It was that conversation in which he was just unable to not make it about himself. It couldn't even be about me on my own birthday. It just always was about him and his own need to gratify himself in some way. And my body was just like, no, you're done now. This is it. This is kind of, and maybe I needed to get to that point, because you can have sort of lingering doubts sometimes when it comes to cutting off contact. You can sort of think, well, is there a way that this could still be salvaged? And that's what I tried to do. But I did get to the point where I finally came to a complete sense of peace and finality about the whole thing. And it honestly felt like a massive relief. It was like a huge burden and a weight had been lifted off my shoulders, to be honest. So I guess the final category of reasons why I went no contact with my dad is just, and I guess this is also sort of interconnected with the two other categories of reasons in its own way, but we just really have nothing in common. And you don't need to have something in common in order to have a relationship with your parent. I fully realize that, you don't need to be best friends or share a ton of common interests. You don't necessarily have to have common ground. As long as there's respect between you, then, that relationship obviously can still be wonderful and it can still work and all the rest. But really, my dad and I are just so unbelievably different. My dad was raised in a very Calvinistic culture. He comes from a very, very puritanical, patriarchal culture. And this has had a very toxic effect on his beliefs about men and women and their roles. He's very racist, very homophobic. He has a lot of very, very toxic beliefs that I obviously completely reject. He is a fundamental Christian, and I don't hold those beliefs anymore. And my dad also just really doesn't have, he's not really able to hold space for people who have different beliefs. He just really rejects, beliefs and viewpoints that don't align with his own when it comes to those issues. And that again kind of contributes to our relationship being very, very superficial, because obviously I don't want to get into arguments about those things with him. What would be the point? He won't listen anyway. So we end up having to avoid a lot of topics. And this is the trouble when you have, a family who's extremely conservative, extremely traditional, comes from a very sort of patriarchal, misogynistic culture and way of thinking that, demonstrates a lot of bigoted beliefs to a lot of other groups of people. you end up just being very limited in what you can talk to them about. And again, I'm not saying that it can't work. People do make it work with their families who have different viewpoints about politics and religion. But to me, honestly, it goes beyond politics and religion. It goes to really treating other people like human beings and basic human dignity and human rights. And I just have such differing feelings and views from my dad and his family when it comes to those issues. I would like to think that I am constantly evolving in terms of my compassion and empathy towards other people. That is how I strive to be. That's how I want to be. I'm always trying to understand other people. I want to understand other people. I want to treat other people with empathy and respect other people's rights. And unfortunately, as I say, my dad comes from that very fundamental Christian, conservative, Calvinistic background where women and people of other racial groups and LGBT people, they're all sort of lesser human beings in my dad's whole worldview. And it's very difficult for me to maintain a relationship with someone like that where I have to pretend that I don't hear the things that they say that really are offensive to me. And where we have to stay away from discussing those topics because, again, he's not particularly interested in my viewpoints if they don't align with his own. And so that was just another kind of layer to the disconnect that I felt with my dad for a very, very long time. As I say, I'm not saying that if your family has different religious, political, views on the world, even if your family has sort of very backward views about the world or even views that you regard as very bigoted, I'm not saying that you have to cut them off. Clearly, that's not always the case. But in my case, it just contributed to the disconnect that I felt with my dad. And I just feel like I just I can't not discuss those topics anymore because they're so important to me. The rights of other people, how other people are treated, and people being seen as equals and all deserving of human rights. Those are topics that are very close to my heart. And to have to deliberately stay away from discussing anything that even verges on those topics because you know that this person that you're talking to doesn't respect your views and isn't capable of having any sort of discussion, that does put a huge strain on conversations. And it creates this huge disconnect. And so, again, that's a huge topic, which, I could easily talk at length about, but I'm going to try and just sort of give an overview of, I just wanted to give an overview of that side of my reasons for going no contact. And if you take it in conjunction with a lot of the other reasons that I've given, I'm sure it makes a lot more sense. My dad was kind of raised with this belief, and this was a belief that he implemented with me and my brother, that, you always honor and obey your parents in every situation. And that means never disagreeing with them. That means never talking back. That means never kind of standing up for yourself against them. That was kind of seen as very like insolent. You're not allowed to have your own individual ideas about things if they clash with your parents, or you can't express those ideas if they clash with your parents. And this is very much the way in which my dad's family functions. It's just an unspoken or unwritten rule of his family that you're all supposed to pretend like you believe the same things. You're supposed to pretend that you have the same religious and political beliefs, and that you see the world the same way, and that you can't discuss, issues where there is a difference of opinion. You can't challenge the views, the prevailing views of the family, no matter how toxic they might be. And I just can't do that anymore. It feels totally inauthentic and wrong to me. And so when taken together with everything else about my relationship with my dad, it was just another layer to why he and I don't connect and why there was just very little to salvage in the relationship. So I don't know if that is, if those considerations might be helpful if you're someone who is thinking about what kind of relationship to have with a parent. You need to question, how much can I show up as myself in this relationship? Does this parent actually respect who I am as an individual? Do they see me as a person who deserves to have their own opinions and views and thoughts? And do they see me as someone who has equal rights with them? And so, yeah, that was a big part of my decision as well. There's probably other reasons that I either haven't thought to discuss in this video or maybe don't want to discuss that have gone into this decision, but these were sort of the main points that I wanted to talk about today. And it's been the right decision for me. I think in your heart, deep down, a lot of the time, whether it is the right decision or not. I'm not saying it's easy. Obviously, it wasn't easy for me. It took me a very, very long time to get to that point, even though there were sort of long periods of time where we didn't have contact. I always reestablished contact at some point and wondered whether the relationship could be salvaged. But I have now got to the point where I believe it's not salvageable. And I'm totally at peace with that. I'm okay with that. I think a big part also of going no contact with the parent is you do have to confront that question of regret. Will I regret going no contact? Will I have regrets if something happened to this parent? It's not a nice thing to think about, I know, but I do think in your own mind, you need to confront these questions. If something happened to my parent, how would I feel about the fact that we've gone no contact? And if you can truly answer that question for yourself and you can be at peace with whatever decision you come to, then that will be a big clue showing you which direction to go in when it comes to this issue. Obviously, no one likes to think of having to make this decision. This is a decision none of us should ever have had to make, really. No one wants to make the decision about whether to go no contact with a parent. I certainly never wanted to make this decision, and it's kind of sad that the heaviness of this decision has laid on me for such a long time. But I have confronted the question of regret, like, would I regret not still being in contact with my dad? And no, I don't think I would. I think I would regret it if I stayed in contact with him, knowing what a toll, having contact with him takes on me. So that's how I feel. That's my story. Or that's one chapter of my story for now. Please feel free to share your experiences or your thoughts in the comments if you want to. And I will make another video in due time. I don't exactly know when it's going to be. I always have to kind of monitor myself to see that I'm emotionally ready to make these videos. But in due time, I will make a video about my relationship with my mother and how I've decided to proceed there. So that will be at some point in the future. Again, I don't know when that will be, but maybe you've got something out of this video about my going no contact with my dad. And if so, as I say, feel free to express it in the comments. But I am just grateful to have the space to talk about this. It feels very liberating to be able to talk about this and to get these feelings and thoughts off my chest. It feels good to just be able to be honest about all this stuff. So thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next video. Bye, everyone.